my name's Sue Monckton-Rickett and this is my husband Chris Monckton-Rickett. We'd like to welcome you to this Spring Harvest seminar dealing with change and loss. We'd like to welcome you into our home, and also we will be welcomed into your home, we hope, as we spend this time together. We apologise if there's any background noise, but our neighbours' children are enjoying themselves self-isolating in the garden. So we're going to spend some time looking at how we deal with change and loss, which is probably something that all of us are having to contemplate at this time. There's probably not been a time in our lives when so much change has happened to so many of us in such a short space of time. Some of it will be small changes, and some of it will be very significant and life-changing events. Whether small or significant, that's not always easy to define, because what's small to me may be very significant to you, and it will also possibly change over time. Some of us may have found adapting not too difficult at this moment. Some of us may have found it quite devastating, but again, that will all change potentially as the situation continues. So what do we think about when we think of loss and change? Well, we'd like to start by saying that all change involves loss, even if the change is perceived to be a positive one. And all loss involves change. Loss and change are inevitable parts of our life, with or without the current situation that we're facing. How we cope with a loss and how we cope with change may be influenced by how much perceived control we think we have over it. And I guess for many of us, the changes that we're all experiencing at the moment are those that are being imposed upon us, and that can make it much harder to deal with. In your own time, you might want to just pause and think for a few moments about how many changes and losses you've experienced and hopefully negotiated well. How much and what has changed in your life in these last few weeks? What you might think is going to change in the next few weeks? And how in control do you feel of your life at this moment in time? When we think about loss and change, and I guess these may be some of the questions that have been going through your mind at this time. First question might be change. What change? It perhaps didn't hit us at the very start of this process of what actually was going to happen. Then there might be the question of, okay, something is very much changing. How can I cope? What impact will this have on me? How will it affect my everyday life? How it will affect my longer term life? How might it affect others, looking at the bigger picture? The people that I know, my relatives, the wider society. A question that none of us can answer at this moment, but is probably in all of our minds, is how long is this change going to last? What will the future look like? Do I think I'm going to be able to adapt and cope? And fundamentally, at the core of the questions in many of our minds may be, who am I in the situation that I'm in?
Many of us at this time, we're probably experiencing more than one kind of change and more than one loss. As Sue said, remembering all loss involves change and all changes involve loss, even if they're welcome, which I guess for many of us at this time, they're not welcome. So what sort of losses, what sort of change events do we experience? The most obvious one, not just in the UK but around the world, is the loss of somebody dying, death. We may fear our own deaths through this. we're not going to cover this, especially in this seminar, as I believe there's another seminar is looking particularly at the effects of dying. It's time for the rest of us. But loss of relationships, maybe that physical presence, the sharing of activities, of our social groups we work with, of work, of actually being physically in church with each other as opposed to through some form of technology or live streaming or whatever's going on. It's weird. It's weird. It's really weird. For many people at this time, the loss of employment currently, or fear of the loss of employment and financial security in the future. The future's unknown. The loss of our roles and purpose in life, our sense of belonging, being able to provide the care and support as we normally would for others, with all the anxieties that bring, and receiving some of the direct support some of us might need. A potential loss of health, the obvious physical things being from the virus, but also our mental well-being as well. And I guess this could be a long-term problem for many people, that we will experience increased mental health problems. Lots of the things we'd planned, significant events, weddings, celebrations, new roles, school leaving events. We know some who are not going to be able to do this. We've got friends, people from our church who are at university at the moment and other schools, and it's a big change. The loss of hopes and dreams and plans, plus what we've perceived as the likely future. How will the world look after this? Lots of people talking about this in TV and so on. Will any form of planned future be possible? Well, not for many of us in detail at the moment. And for some of us in the middle of the coronavirus, many of the normal changes and losses that we would normally be experiencing are still going on. Illnesses, bereavements, deaths from other causes, and so on. And many of the expected, perhaps hoped for changes will not be happening. A new job, moving house, a new school, and so on. Perhaps starting work for the first time. Our vicar at our church was due to move to Cheltenham next week. Well, he stays where he is for the time being. And for many of us, welcome or not, good, bad or indifferent, the loss of our normal lives. Things have changed to some extent. So as we start to look at some of these effects, just almost a few definitions on sort of loss, bereavement, grief, mourning. These words get sort of bandied around. What we mean by loss is the fact of something or someone you no longer have, whether that's temporary or permanent. Bereaved is a word literally means to be torn apart. And the word grief is the response to loss. It's an internal response, and it's the range of our emotions, feelings and thoughts following a loss. Mourning, and this is important at the present time, takes our internal sense of loss and externalizes it. It routinely and normally may be shared and social, rituals and ceremonies, weddings, funerals, or more personal, being allowed to cry, being allowed to talk about the loss with somebody in private. Our external mourning or rites of passages that we normally experience out there in life are for the time being either being postponed or being changed, and we're having to adapt. Things like leaving parties for schools have, for some people, been lost. It's not going to happen. Now, what about the many faces, the many different faces and aspects of loss and change? Well, it all has an effect on us, one way or another. But particularly enforced changes can be a cause of anxiety. We feel out of control. All of our personal histories and family histories involve losses and changes. And these may affect how we react and deal with the current changes and losses and things that will change and may lose further down the line. As I said, the reaction to loss, our response to loss, is grief. It's a natural reaction. It is often confusing, painful, frightening, and above all, messy. It's something, and it's like adapting to changes. We adapt to change or we don't cope. That has to be worked through and is dangerous to repress or ignore. It will come back to bite us if we do. I guess for many of us and for the country as a whole, we're in a sort of survival mode, a coping mode at the moment. And a lot of things are being postponed. But in the longer term, if we don't deal with things now, we will need to process at least permanent losses if we are to stay mentally healthy. A rabbi called Earl Groman wrote the following: grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. It's an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. The price you pay for love. And this is crucial. The only cure for grief is to grieve. And it doesn't feel very good normally. And processing grief, adapting to change, takes energy and is stressful at the best of times. When you add in the outside restrictions on where we are and this time of uncertainty, it's also a time of potentially massively increased stress and anxiety. Now, this is really important for all of us. All of us react individually, and we experience grief and loss and change differently. There are some common features, and this is especially important when we're in forced isolation with others, because although we react individually, how we react may not be how most certainly won't be how the next person reacts. There's no set pattern. And obviously, our way may clash with somebody else's way, and we may be doing a further seminar talking about how we cope with each other and the stresses. But particularly if we've lost things, we all react differently in different ways and at different times, and we can clash with each other, or it can complement ourselves, all of us. So what sort of things do we feel or experience, particularly in heightened times of anxiety? The latest research shows that our effects, our feelings, our emotions to loss, particularly, come in waves. They're all mixed up. And within that, part of the process, there'll be times where we don't feel any loss, times of complete normality. That's okay. But when we do feel things, what are the ranges of things we can feel? Well, maybe a sense of disbelief, of unreality. It's a very strange time. Anger, guilt, whether justified or all too frequently not justified. And we'll talk more about that further on. A sense of sadness, which may be slight or may be overwhelming. Fear, particularly when we don't know what the future holds. A sense of betrayal. A sense of confusion, being shocked. And particularly coping with having to enforce change. A sense of helplessness. A sense of being out of control. Most of us like to be in control of what's happening most of the time. A sense of hopelessness and losing hope. is one of the most serious things that can happen to us. As we said, a sense of being out of control. We may have times when we feel actually some degree of elation, or in some cases a sense of relief. We may experience all sorts of strange physical symptoms and headaches and what have you. And I think for a lot of people, a sense of injustice. And I think it's inevitable. Why me? Or for people we care about or we see in the news who've suffered in some way, why them? Am I going mad? Is the world gone mad? And as I said earlier, particularly at the moment, there's a heightened sense of stress and anxiety for some people, but for others, it may be a sense of acute boredom to cope with the enforced isolation. So what sort of things do we experience with this? And obviously this goes in with what we feel, but maybe a sense of numbness at times. There can be a sense of denial. It's not really happening. It's somewhere else. The switching off of emotions. Maybe we need to do that to cope. The searching for answers. That goes in with the why me. What's happening? Maybe, particularly if we're feeling guilty about things, going over and over events again, thinking, should we have done something differently? We may feel restless. We're certainly aware of people who are crying at this time with the sadness of what's happening. We may also experience sometimes, with some of us in extreme losses, a sense of hallucinations, of seeing a presence, of hearing voices of someone. That's quite normal. It's nothing to be afraid of, and it will pass. Particularly at this time, I think that with the excess anxiety may come in, and that's not a nice feeling. And indeed, for some, a sort of minor traumatic thing of panic attacks. They're more frightening than dangerous, but nonetheless, they're not nice. And there are things going on with the hormones, stress hormones and things in our bodies. Probably serious, and another cause for fear is, if we really are experiencing a loss and grief, is a lowering of our immune system, and that's the last thing we could do with it this time, which can again lead to a greater sense of fear, more prone to ordinary illnesses and infections, some degree of physical pain. And it helps to cope to have enough sleep and to have a decent diet, but there's a sense of disturbed sleeping or eating that just makes us feel worse. We may start feeling absent-minded. Some of us are like that at the best of times, or so I've been told. Frequently, I believe.
But you can't remember.
But yeah, thank you. There is a point on this. We're actually very different from each other in how we react. There may be a treasuring or avoiding of reminders. And I just want to talk very briefly at this time when people are experiencing sudden and violent losses, as it were, violent not necessarily physically, but in terms of the sudden, dramatic, that idea of a tearing change and loss of trauma. A word that gets bandied around, it has some clinical definitions. It is commonplace when there's a sudden change or loss to experience a traumatic effect within our bodies and brains. If normally, say when we for the first time, however scary and unpleasant the reactions are, and they are unpleasant, they will pass in time, usually within the first month or so, which is why, in terms of coping with this, we don't normally go piling into traumas as professionals in the first month or so. We just sort of keep an eye and support, and usually for most people it will pass. If, on the other hand, it doesn't, or it may activate previous unprocessed trauma, this is quite a scary state to be in. You may have really strong reactions and may need to look for further help, which again can be quite difficult at this time. And I just say here and now, we're hoping to produce the trauma for spring harvest at home on dealing with the sense of traumatic loss or other traumas on us, particularly when there's a sense of heightened anxiety. And if we don't, we'll try and get some handouts, some stuff perhaps to go on the website with some suggested self-help resources and so on and what to do. The problem I say with loss, just to confirm, is if we do have like post-traumatic stress, is the effects inside the body and the effects of grief inside us actually conflict with each other, and one can trigger the other and backwards and forwards, and that does require quite a bit of skilled help to work through.
Okay, so grief is a natural process, as Chris said. It's something that we go through because we need to, and it's something that, and that's the whole concept, we have to go through grief. As that lovely quote from the rabbi says, the only way of dealing with grief is to go through grief. And it's the mechanism by which we cope with our losses. There is no rigid timetable in how we deal with grief. It would be fantastic if we could say it goes from this stage to this stage to this stage in a nice linear line and we come out at the other end. But that just isn't how it works. The reactions to grief are obviously often described as being much more cyclical. We can experience a whole gamut of emotions within a few seconds and at the same time as each other and in any order. And so the things that Chris talked about earlier are not in a nice straight pattern. They're just things that are happening to us, that we're experiencing, that we're feeling. Whatever our grief process is, however long that might take, whatever way we may do it, there's often described as some tasks that we have to achieve. And again, they're not in a nice linear pattern. We have to accept the reality of our loss, but that can come in different stages and at different times. What experience of loss, what I'm accepting as a loss today, can come back in 2 months' time, and it'll be a different type of loss attached to the same event, but I'm losing something else. Some of you may remember a lady called Joni Eareckson Tada, who became paralysed from a swimming accident. She talks about the fact that first she lost she had to mourn and work through the process of the loss of her legs, the movement in her legs, and then the loss of movement in her arms. And then she worked through, what does that mean about my loss of independence? And then more and more things until she had to just process them all. So the reality of the loss doesn't just happen once. It can happen in many different aspects and at many different times. We have to work through our grief and our pain for each of those losses. We have to adjust to a changed life. We've all had to do that in this current situation very, very quickly. One day we were going shopping, 3 days later we weren't. One day we were going to a football match, 3 days later we weren't. We've had to change very, very quickly, but actually mentally adjusting to what does that change may take us longer than the imposed physical adjustment. And we have to find the right place in our emotions, in our psychology, in our life for that with which we have lost. Where does it now all fit together? And only then can we move on with life. But as I said, it's not a straightforward process. It's not one step follows neatly on from another. It will go round and round in circles, and it happens in our own time and our own space, and as Chris said earlier, in our own way. Something I just want to briefly touch on before we start to look at what helps, how do we process loss, is something called anticipatory grief. And it's a sense in which I'm experiencing ongoing losses at this moment, but I'm also waiting or expecting for a new loss. Very often it's talked about when people are caring for someone that's dying or that's perhaps got dementia and capacities being lost, that they're dealing with today's losses, but knowing there'll be some more tomorrow. And this could be the same for us in the situation we find ourselves now. There's been lots of change and lots of loss we're processing at the moment, but many of us may be wondering, am I about to lose my job? Is my business about to go? What's going to happen to the family members that are ill, whether that's with coronavirus or with any other illness? So we're anticipating future losses, as well as experiencing our current change and loss. And it can be very exhausting because there's no end point to it, and it wears us down. It can feel even more than Chris talks about powerlessness and hopelessness and helplessness in general in loss and grief. But when we're in a place of anticipatory grief, we can feel even more as though we're powerless. We can't change the future. And we can feel trapped and a sense of frustration. And there's also that sense of, again, Chris talked about anxiety and heightened anxiety at this moment. And when we're expecting something to change, another loss, we can have a heightened sense of anxiety that we're trying to live with and cope with. So how do we work through loss, change, grief, the situations that we find ourselves in? So I guess the first thing to say is be real with yourself and be real with God. There's no oughts or shoulds when it comes to how we feel, when it comes to grief. We can't be told this is how you should be feeling. And please try not to hide your feelings from God. You may need to protect yourself a bit from exposing them to everybody else, but be honest with yourself and be honest with God. Try to find ways to express your feelings safely. Try to avoid, if you can, making major decisions at this time. You may have decisions forced upon you that you can do nothing about. But it's a bit kind of let the dust settle, get used to the new normal before you start to make any other decisions. It may help that you make some kind of list of the changes that you're experiencing at this time, or that you've dealt with in the past. And it may help because you may be able to think about what actually helped me to get through them. How did I negotiate that change? Can I use any of those techniques or any of those thought processes that I had before? Be realistic about what you can and can't do in the current circumstances. Chris spoke about false guilt, thinking of someone who's had real guilt because they couldn't be with a relative who needed some treatment at hospital. There was nothing this person could do about it, but often we can take on false guilt. And so sometimes we actually have to sit down and think about, is this really something I can do anything about? Should I feel guilty or shouldn't I? And let ourselves off the hook for the false guilt. It's not real and there's nothing we can do about it. Chris said about looking after yourself physically, sleeping, eating, physical exercise. Even whatever circumstances we might find ourselves in, we know that physical exercise may not be as easy as it was, but try to do something every day. Another issue that Chris touched upon was the fact that we're all experiencing change and loss. We will all experience it differently, and we're all suddenly trapped in a house or in a flat or wherever together. And so it's important that we perhaps have a conversation about what is it doing to each of us? What would help each of us? For one of us, it may be that Chris and I said that we're very different. So Chris will process things by going off into a quiet room and perhaps listening to music or something. My natural processing is probably to talk to someone. So we need to negotiate. How does that work when we can't escape each other's company, really? But it's really important because otherwise it will cause conflict and it will cause more anxiety. So talk to each other about how you process loss, what's important to you. Make some contact with the outside world. There's whether it's telephone or online or whatever it is, but make some contacts with the outside world. Find things that are an expression of who you are. We're all in a place where our roles could be changing, where our sense of belonging is changing, and that fundamentally affects, we said at the start, the who am I question, affects our identity. And so finding things to do that actually are an expression of who we are, whatever that might be, whether that's playing some music, whether that's writing, whether that's making a cake, whether that's gardening if we have a garden, but something that actually says, this is me. There's some creativity outside of me that has some almost fingerprint of who I am. Those things can also be things that we find enjoyable or relaxing, and that's really important. That whole slowing the body down, slowing the brain down if we're anxious, and having input into ourselves that's actually positive for ourselves. And try to make some plans, even if they're only tiny. It may just be, I'm planning that I will ring X person every Wednesday. But actually feeling that you're in control of life a bit may be very important. Actually being able to say, for some of us, having a structure, having a routine is actually really critical. And so having some plan, even though it's small, may be really important to how we deal with the current situation. And I guess the other thing is for us to think about, how can we help other people to deal with the change and loss that they may be in? Well, we can be a listening ear. We may not be able to be a physical presence, but we can be a listening ear. We can be someone that may be able to help people to express their feelings, to share their concerns. It's really important that you don't feel you need to have all the answers, because if we're honest, none of us have got the answers at the moment. And often trite answers are worse than no answers at all. But never underestimate the value of listening. But allow people space and time as well. Invite them if they want to share with you. Invite them if they want to have a phone call, but allow them to say no. Don't judge emotions, reactions, responses. Encourage them that a lot of the things that we've talked about earlier, which sometimes can seem quite strange, are actually quite normal. They're not going mad. They are just processing and dealing with their loss. None of us have the answers theologically, so let's just stand with people in their grief, in their pain. We can't explain what's going on, and we don't have to justify God, and we're not called to. We're called to stand with people and to love them, just as Jesus stood with people in their grief and loved them. Help people to work out how they can take care of themselves, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Pray for people. Knowing of resources that might help them, that may have to be online stuff at the moment, but there are online resources, websites that can help people going through times of change and loss. And finally, when you're looking after others or caring for others, look after yourselves. You too, like us, will be experiencing change and loss in our own lives. And through that, we need to help. We can only help others when we've helped ourselves, when we've cared for ourselves. So don't deny what's going on in you. Do all the things that you do for others for yourself, and then you'll be much better equipped to help other people. There's a quote from Omri, who many of you may have heard of, who was a priest and a psychologist. And he says this: "The friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate the not knowing, the not healing, the not curing, that is a friend who cares."
That's the sort of friend we could all do with at difficult times, and the sort of friend perhaps we should try to be. which leads on to the final part. We're just going to end with a prayer. But where is God? I haven't got an answer. Where is God in this? All I can say, and it's some cliches with us. I'd just like to start with a quote, perhaps looking at parts of Jesus' life in a minute. But from C.S. Lewis, A Grief Observed, it's a classic. Remembering that in time C.S. Lewis got through his sense of loss and change. It's not about getting over it, it's getting through it and moving beyond. C.S. Lewis said the following: "Meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you are happy, you will be, so it seems, welcomed into his arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? The door slammed in your face, and the sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence." And I guess there are times when we all experience that sort of sense of being ignored. We don't hear audible words from God every time we pray, if we're realistic. Looking at part of Jesus' life, at this time, as we approach the time this is broadcast, it is Easter, and Easter week. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus, when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Isn't that just the sort of feelings that C.S. Lewis experienced? The Bible tells us Jesus was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And thinking about it, if you look at the story of Jesus and the tomb of Lazarus, and we look at the resurrection of Lazarus, and he'd been dead for 3 days and what have you, but looking at Jesus' emotions, he'd had a sudden violent loss and change on his friend Lazarus when he went there. And he wept with those who wept there. Not for them, but for himself, his own reaction. And some of our Bibles talk in nice language about troubled in heart. I can remember somebody who was a senior Baptist minister at a retreat day saying what this passage really means, is incandescent with rage, injustice, and what was happening. And that's what Jesus experienced as well. And if he experiences it, we're going to experience it. And it's okay to question God. It's okay to be real. It's okay to be not okay, if you know what I mean. It's where we are. It's as we are. Jesus experienced major changes and losses in his own life. Jesus prepared for the changes for himself. He particularly looked like he always enjoyed them. And Jesus prepared his disciples, his followers, people who were just like us. And yet I found one of the great hopes is when you look at their reactions to the losses and changes, they didn't get it right all the time. They weren't okay all the time, but they got through it. And I find that, I don't know about you, quite encouraging. That they can be as bad as I can be. And during the change process and experiencing, we don't know where we're going, when we don't know what's going to happen. And ultimately, going back to the C.S. Lewis quote, thinking about footprints. If you're a new Christian and you don't know what footprints are, you will very soon, I guarantee you, find out. It's become a cliche. It's a true story, I believe. But we've got a mug out there somebody's given us with footprints on it. We know the story of being carried by God. But there is something far more serious than just being a nice poem that you get on Christian greeting cards. It is about not our faithfulness in God, which can go up and down with how we feel at different times. It's about God's faithfulness towards us, for us. Have you ever thought about We won't go on and on and on about our faith in God, but about God's faith in us. But what that can feel like while we're being carried, we only find out, we only realise sometimes afterwards. I'd like to end with a prayer of faith, which on the face of it is about our response to God. But actually, really, the key part of this, I see it as being that God is faithful in us and always there. And it's not one of mine. It's come from the Northumbria Community Prayer Book, which I tend to use at home. Lord, you have always given bread for the coming day. And though I am poor, today I believe. Lord, you have always given strength for the coming day. And though I am weak, today I believe. Lord, you have always given peace for the coming day. And though of anxious heart, today I believe. Lord, you've always kept me safe in trials, and now, tried as I am, today I believe. Lord, you've always marked the road for the coming day, and though it may be hidden, today I believe. And Lord, you have always spoken when time was ripe, and though you be silent now, today I believe. What we'd like to say to follow up this is, by the time this hopefully is broadcast, we can put a copy of some of this with some more details. Will be on the Spring Harvest website, along with some suggested resources from self-help, things you can order, and so on. And also, as well as that, if and or, as it were, we're both registered professional counsellors, and the boss here really is the boss, because she's the executive chair of our professional body, the Association of Christian Counsellors. And a copy of this and some resources, I'm told it will be on our professional body website, which is www.acc-uk.org. That's right, isn't it? That's right. Yes, I've done as I'm told.
So we'd like to say thank you for joining us. We hope that this seminar has been of help to you and perhaps help to others. And we hope too that you will find the other resources that Spring Harvest at Home are producing during this week to be helpful and encouraging to you at this time. And please share this with other members of your church. Despite Spring Harvest not happening, this is an opportunity for it to reach many more people. And so please do share all that's been going on the Spring Harvest at Home website with other people. And we pray that God will take care of you and your families as we go through this time.
The other thing, Spring Harvest are doing a website, a place you can request prayer to be passed to others. And we know people in teams who are going to back this in prayer. So if you have any particular requests like that, please send them to Spring Harvest. Arrangements are being made for people to commit to pray behind this.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.